History is full of names scratched into ledgers, carved into stone, or lost in the dust that gathers between one generation and the next. But every so often, a story survives. Not because the world chose to remember it, but because someone refused to let it disappear. This is the story of Ezra and Ruth, two settlers who faced the Nebraska prairie with little more than a borrowed plow, an old Union badge, and a belief that the land could be persuaded to love them back. What we know comes from a photograph, cracked, weathered, fused into iron by time. But what it represents is far greater. This is a story of endurance, of love, of the quiet, stubborn courage that built the American West. Let us begin in the spring of 1871. The prairie was not gentle that year. In May 1871, the wind rolled across Nebraska like an invisible tide, slow, heavy, and wise to the ways of breaking men. It bent the grass in wide, sweeping arcs and carried with it the smell of soil warming under a reluctant sun. Ezra Hale stood at the edge of his newly staked homestead, one boot planted on the boundary marker he had hammered in only an hour before. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly against his ribcage with a Union badge tarnished by the sweat of battles he never talked about. The war had taken his arm but kept him alive, for reasons he still wasn't sure he believed in. Beside him stood Ruth, not yet 20, hair bound in a dark braid, dress dusted with road grit, and eyes sharp enough to cut through the wind. Her hand rested on the plow he'd borrowed from a neighbor 2 miles south. Ezra wondered, not for the first time, whether she knew she had married a man who could give her only half of the life he once imagined. But Ruth squeezed his good hand before he could apologize again for something she did not consider a flaw. The photographer, a traveling man named Porter with a half-broken mule, balanced his camera on a tree stump. He muttered curses as the wind tugged at the tripod legs. "Hold still," Porter barked, pulling his hood over his head. "Wind's got a mind of its own today." Ezra tried to straighten, but the stump of his left arm ached beneath the pinned sleeve. Ruth shifted slightly, placing one hand firm on the plow handle they would share for decades to come. Porter lifted the plate from the camera with care. He looked at them, the one-armed veteran and the girl with more steel in her spine than in the rails of a locomotive. "Ready," he said. The wind gusted, the tripod shuddered, the prairie roared. But the plate held. In that moment, two small figures stood against an endless horizon, unaware that the land they claimed would test them beyond anything the war or the road had yet delivered. Unaware that future generations would one day stare at their frozen faces and search for the beginning of a legacy. Ezra reached for Ruth's hand. She didn't let go. The sod house rose from the ground like something the prairie grudgingly allowed. Ezra cut blocks of earth, heavy, damp, and stubborn, layering them to form walls thicker than a man's forearm. The roof sagged slightly, supported by timbers taken from a cottonwood that had survived lightning, storms, and the teeth of wandering buffalo. Ruth insisted on whitewashing the inside with chalk and river water. "Light makes rooms feel bigger," she said. Ezra suspected she meant less lonely. They stored potatoes in a pit by the north wall, hung dried herbs from the rafters, and tethered their only cow, an old brindled creature named Mercy, to a stake near the door. The wind never stopped. Day or night, it prowled around the soddy, slipping through cracks, rattling tin cookware, moaning across the chimney like a voice that couldn't form proper words. By November, the first blizzards came. Mercy grew thin. Their wheat crop failed. The nights crept so deep into the bones that sometimes Ezra woke to find Ruth shivering, despite 2 quilts and the warmth of his body pressed against hers. He split firewood with one arm, gripping the axe handle close and driving it downward with all the force he could muster. His shoulders burned, his legs trembled, but he kept swinging. Winter didn't negotiate. On Christmas morning, Mercy did not rise. By nightfall, she was gone. Ezra buried the cow beneath the cottonwood and said nothing when Ruth placed a handful of wheat kernels on the mound. "For luck," she whispered. Luck did not come. In early 1872, Ruth fell ill. It began with a cough, dry, persistent, easily dismissed. But within days, she was feverish and shaking, unable to stand without support. Ezra held her head as she drank water, kept cold cloths on her forehead, and read to her from the only book they owned, a battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Snow piled against the door so high that Ezra had to dig a tunnel each morning just to reach the surface. The wind shrieked like something alive. He tore apart half the roof beams for firewood. He worked until his vision blurred. And all the while, Ruth drifted somewhere between sleep and silence. One night, convinced she would not survive until dawn, Ezra took the plow blade, their only plow, the one they had touched together on the day of the photograph, and carved her initials into its metal surface. R.H. He pressed his forehead to the cold iron. "If the land remembers you," he whispered, "then maybe I can find a way to live in it." But Ruth did not die. Her fever broke in late February. The thaw came early, and by March she could walk again, though she moved slower, spoke softer, and slept with her hand curled into Ezra's shirt, as if afraid the winter might return to claim her. He never told her about the initials on the plow. Not then. From 1873 to 1887, the prairie changed, slowly at first, like a weary animal learning to trust these newcomers. Grass gave way to furrows. Furrows gave way to wheat and corn, then to a house made of boards, brought in by wagon from a sawmill 3 counties east. Ezra built a barn big enough for 2 horses and a mule. Ruth filled the shelves with jars of preserves, plums, chokecherries, pumpkins glazed with molasses. They planted windbreaks of Osage orange, raised chickens that never stayed in their coop, learned the pattern of storms by the smell of the air. Ezra lost none of his humility, but the weight in his shoulders eased. He could hitch a plow with one hand now, tie a rope with his teeth and fingers, and swing a hammer with the precision of a craftsman who learned to trust the angle of his wrist. Ruth became the heart of the homestead. Neighbors came to her for remedies, advice, and warm bread. Children adored her. Even stray dogs followed her to the door. And yet, every time a storm cloud rose in the west, she touched the plow blade in the barn where it hung like an ugly memory made holy by survival. Ezra saw her do it. He said nothing. The photograph from 1871 hung above their door, corners cracked by frost, edges curled by summers so hot they melted wax. The 2 figures looked so young, so determined, so unaware of how the land would shape them. They worked the soil together. They survived droughts, grasshoppers, hailstones as big as apples. They held funerals for neighbors and christenings for newborns. They grew older, slower, wiser. But they grew together. In the summer of 1888, the railroad came. First came the rumor, whispered in the general store, argued over at the blacksmith's, repeated by travelers passing through. Then came the stakes, thin wooden markers pounded into the ground by men in canvas hats and dust-covered coats. Surveyors walked across Ezra's fields with rolled maps and measuring tools that glinted in the sun. One of them, Mr. Orrin Hathaway, bold, red-faced, and certain of his importance, knocked on the hail door. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, barely waiting to be invited in. "Your quarter section lies directly in the path of the proposed line. The company is prepared to offer a generous sum." Ezra listened quietly. He'd heard about such things. The railroad took what it wanted. Money was merely a courtesy. Hathaway named a figure. It was more than Ezra had ever seen on paper. He felt Ruth stiffen beside him. "We'll think on it," Ezra said. But the moment the man left, Ruth walked out to the barn, returned with the 1871 photograph, and without a word tore it from its hook. Ezra followed her, startled. "Ruth?" She strode to the field, to the plow Ezra still used each spring, the same one with her initials carved into the blade. She held the photograph against the metal, hammered a nail through it, and let the prairie wind whip her hair into a frenzy. "Let them see what this land means to us," she said. "Let them look at our faces before they decide to carve a railroad through our lives." Hathaway returned the next week. He saw the plow. He saw the photograph. He looked at Ezra and then at Ruth, whose expression held more warning than any weapon. The railroad shifted its planned route. The company built their line 1 mile south instead. Neighbors whispered that it was the only time they'd ever known a railroad to walk away from a fight. From 1889 to 1915, the Hale farm thrived. Children filled the house: nieces, nephews, neighbor boys who came to learn how to plow a straight line. Ezra and Ruth never had children of their own, though no one dared to ask why. Some said the winter of 1872 had changed her body. Others said the land had chosen a different legacy for them. Ruth taught local girls to read. Ezra taught boys to carve wood, repair harness straps, and treat tools with respect. They hosted barn dances, harvest suppers, and mourned with families when the flu swept through the county. The world changed around them. Telegraphs came, gas lamps, automobiles that sputtered like angry machines. Visitors from Chicago who marveled at the wide Nebraska horizon as if seeing the sky for the first time. But Ezra and Ruth remained rooted, solid, steady, and grateful. Every year, on the anniversary of the day Porter took their photograph, Ruth placed a hand on the plow. Every year, Ezra whispered a quiet thank you to the land that had almost buried them, but instead chose to let them stay. Time did what time always does. Ezra's hair turned the color of snow. Ruth's hands shook when she kneaded dough. They moved slower, rested more, and sat beside each other on the porch during long golden evenings when the prairie grass shimmered like a vast waving sea. Ruth passed first. It was late autumn, 1916. The fields lay bare, the barn smelled of hay and old tools, and the horizon glowed with the low, amber sun of a dying year. Ezra held her hand as she slipped away. Her fingers curled around his, the same way they had on the day she nearly died, the same way they had on the day the photographer captured their youth. He buried her beneath the cottonwood, beside the grave of Mercy the cow, because Ruth always said that tree had the best shade in the world. Ezra lived another 7 years. He spoke less, worked less, and spent his mornings sitting beside the plow in the barn as if it were an old friend who needed company. When he died in 1923, neighbors found the plow blade polished clean around the carved initials, RH, as if someone had been touching it every day. Decades passed. The farm changed hands. Fences went up, roads shifted, the old barn sagged but refused to fall. The plow migrated from barn to shed to fence row, left leaning against a post where rain, dust, and rust slowly claimed it. The photograph Ruth had nailed to the blade stayed there, though its image faded into a ghostly blur of lines and shadows. By 1956, all that remained was a rusted rectangle of metal fused to the plow, like a scar the prairie refused to heal. Ezra and Ruth had been reduced to stories told by old-timers, half-remembered legends about a one-armed veteran and the woman who refused to yield to a railroad. But then came the boy. He was 22, fresh from college, curious about the land his ancestors once farmed. He walked along the fence line on a warm July afternoon, kicking at weeds, breathing the hot, dusty air, trying to imagine what life had been like before tractors and telephones. That's when he saw it, a shape half swallowed by tall grass. Old iron, bent wood, something forgotten but unmistakably important. He knelt and brushed soil from the metal. The plow blade caught the sunlight, flashing faintly despite the rust, and then he saw the photograph. Or what was left of it, a rusted rectangle fused to the iron, barely an outline. A shadow of two figures standing against a horizon. He pried it free, carefully, reverently, and held it in his hands for a long time. Later, at the county museum, he hung the framed remnant beside an old deed written in looping 19th century script. Refused sale, 1888, love stronger than steel. Visitors paused to look at it. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. The great-grandson traced the rusted edges and whispered the names he had grown up hearing only in stories. Ezra and Ruth. The prairie forgets many things. Names, footsteps, the sound of laughter carried on the wind. But it remembers those who refused to let go of it. Those who lived, struggled, fought, and loved upon its soil. Ezra and Ruth were not famous. They were not wealthy. They did not write books or build monuments. But they left behind something stronger, a story etched into metal, held in a single fading photograph, and carried forward by descendants who understood that some legacies are built not from glory, but from endurance. The horizon they once stared at, unsure of what the future would bring, ended up holding them, shaping them, and keeping their memory alive long after they were gone. And sometimes, if you visit the county museum on a quiet afternoon, you can stand before the rusted rectangle and imagine the wind of 1871, the steadiness of Ruth's hand, and the resilience in Ezra's eyes. A reminder that love, real love, can shift the course of railroads, outlast the coldest winters, and endure long enough to be found by a great-grandson searching for the beginning of his family's story. Some stories live in books, some live in monuments, but this one lives in iron, and in the land that refused to forget.